The Wyoming Territory, 1879. Juniper Crossing was not so much a town as a scar on the land. Raw and bleeding red dust. It existed for one reason, the railroad depot. But the railroad had paused, and the town held its breath, waiting for the money or the momentum to return. The wind never paused. It was a high, dry wind from the plains, smelling of alkali and distance. It scoured the main street, which was just packed earth and mule droppings. It kicked up veils of that fine, iron-red dust, making the air taste like old blood. The dust coated everything. It settled in the folds of the canvas awnings and silted up on the windowsills of the false-fronted buildings. A sign above the depot, its black paint flaking, swung on one hinge. It screamed, a high, grinding squeal of metal on metal that set a man's teeth on edge. It was the only constant sound in town, louder than the saloon's tinny piano, louder than the blacksmith's hammer. It was the sound of thirst. On the shaded boardwalk outside the general store, a cluster of men idled. They were the kind of men drawn to places like Juniper Crossing ranch hands between drives, prospectors whose luck had run dry, and drifters who were simply waiting for something to happen. They leaned against the splintered pine supports, their hats tipped low, their boots stained and worn. The air around them was thick with the smell of cheap barley wine and rank tobacco. Boredom was a physical weight, and they relieved it with cruelty. Their attention was fixed on the noon stagecoach, which was late, as usual. But before the stage, the big freight wagon had arrived, pulled by a 6-mule team, its driver spitting curses and dust. Hell of a choice. Boys. One of the men, a lanky man named Shay, drawled. He spat a stream of brown juice that sizzled on the hot boards. The stage brings the delicate ones, but the freight brings the sturdy ones. A few women, passengers from the wagon, were hurrying toward the hotel, their bonnets pulled low, their expressions tight. They were mail-order brides, or perhaps a preacher's sisters. They were pale and looked breakable. Shay laughed, a sound like gravel rattling in a tin cup. Pick any girl you want. Harris, the railroad's paying in scrip, but the depot's paying in women today. The other men joined in, a chorus of rough, barking laughter. It was a game they played, a game of assessment, of dividing the world into things they could and could not have, things they could and could not break, standing apart from them. Rafe Calder watched. He was not leaning. He stood with his weight balanced, his back to a water trough near his own wagon. He was a tall man, quiet in his movements. His hat was old, stained dark with sweat, its brim flat. His canvas shirt was a faded blue, bleached pale across the shoulders by 1,000 days of sun. He did not look at the men. He looked at the wind, at the ears of his horse, at the way the freight driver handled the brake. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were busy measuring. He measured the tension in the air, the impatience of the mules, the competence of the driver, and he measured the men's laughter. Then, from the freight wagon, another passenger emerged. This was not one of the pale, hurrying women. This woman did not hurry. She swung herself down from the high seat, not waiting for the driver's offered hand. She landed on the street with a solid, definitive thump. Her boots were practical, a man's boots, scuffed at the toe but well-oiled. She was tall, taller than most of the men lounging on the boardwalk. And she was not built like the women in the mail-order catalogs. Her skin was the color of strong tea, browned by a sun she had not hidden from. Her hair, a dark brown, was pulled back in a severe, functional knot. The dress she wore was rough spun, the color of buckwheat, and it was made for work, not for show. It pulled tight across a pair of shoulders that were broad and capable. Her arms, bare to the elbow as she rolled her sleeves up, showed the long, lean muscle of someone who did not just sew, but who hauled and lifted and labored. This was Lydia Hale. She was listed on the passenger manifest as a seamstress. She moved to the back of the wagon and grabbed the handle of a large, sea-green trunk. It was clearly heavy. She braced her feet in the dust, bent her knees, and, with a clean lift, hauled it over the tailgate, and settled it onto the ground. She did not grunt. She did not stagger. She simply did the work that was required. The men on the boardwalk fell silent for a beat, watching the display of strength. Then Shay exploded in laughter. "God almighty," he hooted, slapping his thigh. "Look at the size of that one. She's built like a prize bull." Another man chimed in. "I reckon she's better at hauling freight than she is at hauling." Affection. The laughter that followed was meaner this time, sharper. It was laced with derision. Even a few of the respectable townswomen, passing by on the far side of the street, permitted themselves a small, unkind titter behind their gloves. Lydia Hale heard it. Rafe saw her back stiffen. Just for a second. Her shoulders, which had been set for work, now set themselves for armor. She did not turn. She did not acknowledge the voices. She simply stared at her trunk, her jaw tight, bracing herself for whatever humiliation came next. She had heard this song before. It was always the same tune, just played by different drunken musicians. The laughter died abruptly. It was cut short, as if a door had been slammed, into that sudden, heavy quiet. Rafe Calder's voice spoke. It was not loud, but it cut through the air, clear and resonant. Her. The men on the boardwalk turned. Shay, his mouth still open in a grin, looked confused. "What's that?" Calder. Rafe pushed himself away from the water trough. He took one step forward, into the harsh sunlight. He did not look at the men. He looked at Lydia. He raised his hand, not just a lift of the chin, but a deliberate, steady arm, and he pointed. "Her," he said again, his voice flat. "The one you call too big." The silence that fell this time was absolute. It was thick. A man who had been about to spit froze, the tobacco juice dribbling onto his chin. The depot sign gave another agonizing shriek, a sound that seemed to slice the tension. A horse stamped its hoof, the sound like a distant rifle shot. The men were not laughing. They were not even smiling. They were processing what had just happened. Rafe Calder, who spoke perhaps 20 words a day, who kept to his failing ranch and his own counsel, had just stepped into their game. And he had not just challenged them. He had turned their own insult into a public declaration. Lydia Hale turned slowly. Her face was a mask of careful neutrality, but her eyes were bright and wary. She looked at Rafe Calder. This, she thought, was the next part of the joke. This was the trap. This was the part where the quiet one pretended to be her champion, only to lead her into a deeper, more painful humiliation for the crowd's entertainment. She had been a wager before. She knew the shape of this particular cruelty. Her hands, calloused and strong, clenched at her sides. Rafe ignored the gaping men. He walked past them, his boots making a soft, steady sound in the thick dust. He did not stop until he was a respectable 5 feet away from her. He did not crowd her. He did not smile. He simply looked at her, his gaze as assessing as it had been on the freight driver. He touched the brim of his hat. It was a gesture of polite habit, not a flourish. "Ma'am," he said. Lydia waited. She said nothing. "My name is Rafe Calder," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I own the Blue Mesa spread, north of here. I'm in need of help." Her suspicion only deepened. Help, her voice was clearer, lower pitched than the other women's. "I'm a seamstress, Mr. Calder. The sign at the depot said there was work for a seamstress." "I know what the sign said." Rafe's eyes flicked for a half-second to her hands, noting the calluses, the strength. "But I was at the relay station 2 hours back when your wagon stopped to water. I saw you mend the driver's harness. He was fussing with a broken trace, and you took it from him. You spliced that leather and stitched it tight in under 10 minutes, a stitch I've seen harness makers charge $5 for." He paused, letting his words settle. "I need grit," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "And I need skill. I don't need someone who is lightweight." Lydia stared at him. She searched his face, his steady gray eyes. She was an expert in lies and mockery. She had lived a life decoding the space between what men said and what they meant. In his gaze, she found neither. There was no pity. There was no hidden laughter. There was assessment. He had watched her, not as a woman, but as a worker. He had seen her competence. He was not offering her a rescue. He was offering her a position. "I don't believe in fairy tales. Mr. Calder," she said, her voice rough. "I'm not offering one." "Ma'am," he replied, his tone unchanged. "I'm offering hard work. I'm offering fair pay, and a roof that doesn't leak much." Lydia looked away from him, back at the line of gaping men on the boardwalk. They were silent now, sullen and confused. She looked at the peeling paint of the general store, at the dust devils dancing in the street. This town offered her nothing but more of the same. More whispers, more jokes, more nights spent patching other people's clothes in a cramped back room. She turned back to Rafe Calder. His face was weathered, and he looked tired, but his eyes were straight. He had not flinched. She gave one short, decisive nod. "All right, Mr. Calder, I accept." Rafe nodded back, as if the matter was settled, which it was. He turned, grabbed her heavy sea-green trunk, and with a grunt of effort that proved its weight, he hefted it and began carrying it to his own wagon. Across the street, in the deep, cool shade of the Golden Slipper Saloon, a man watched the entire exchange. He was dressed in a clean wool vest and a white shirt, his boots polished to a high shine despite the dust. This was Clive Mercer, the man who owned the saloon, and, more importantly, the man who was quietly buying up the water rights to the whole valley. He had been sipping a glass of Tennessee whiskey. He did not laugh like the fools on the boardwalk. He did not gape. He smiled. It was a thin, tight smile that did not reach his eyes. He watched Rafe Calder, the one rancher who refused to sell, the one man stubbornly holding onto that dry patch of land at Blue Mesa. He watched Calder heave the big woman's trunk into his wagon. Mercer swirled the whiskey in his glass, the ice clinking softly. This was new. Calder was desperate, clearly, but this was an interesting, unpredictable kind of desperate. This, Clive Mercer thought as he took a slow sip, might be very amusing indeed. The wagon cleared the last miserable shack of Juniper Crossing. The town vanished behind them, swallowed instantly by the prairie. The only sound was the steady clop-clop thump of the two draft horses, the squeal of the wagon springs, and the high, thin cry of the wind. They were moving north, toward the low, bruised line of hills that Rafe had called the Blue Mesa Spread. The landscape was immense, terrifying in its emptiness. The prairie was not the vibrant green of storybooks. It was a vast, rolling ocean of ash-green grama grass, cured dry by the relentless sun. The horizon was a hard, cold purple line that seemed to recede no matter how long they drove toward it. The sky was not blue. It was a pale, washed-out sheet of white heat. The silence between them was thick. It was not the awkward, fidgeting silence of a parlor. This was a different quality. It was a weighted silence, taut and strong, like a newly oiled strap of harness leather. It was the quiet of two people who had both seen too much to waste energy on small talk. They sat side by side on the wagon bench, a respectable foot of worn wood between them. Rafe Calder did not ask questions. He observed. His gaze was steady on the horizon, on the ears of his team. He watched the way a hawk circled, the way the dust rose from a dry creek bed 2 miles to the east. He seemed to be listening to the land itself. Lydia Hale sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her back straight. She had spent the last 3 months on wagons, stages, and trains. She had left Pennsylvania in disgrace, or what her family had called disgrace. Lydia called it survival. She remembered the mud. Pennsylvania was not dry. It was wet and heavy and suffocating. She remembered the smell of the blacksmith's forge her father ran, the acidic bite of coal smoke, the hiss of hot iron in the slack tub. She had grown up with the clang of the anvil in her bones, and she remembered the voices. Such a shame, that Hale girl, built like her father's anvil, too much of her, just too much, in the East. A woman was meant to be an ornament, a delicate thing. Lydia had been strong. She had been capable, and she had been despised for it. A memory flashed, sharp and unwelcome. of a humid afternoon storm. The creek had flooded, turning the forge yard into a thigh-deep soup of mud and coal slurry. One of the new iron stoves, ready for shipment, had been at risk of being washed away. Her father and his apprentice struggled, their boots sucking in the mire. Lydia, then just 16, had waded in. She had found her purchase, used the leverage she instinctively understood, and helped them haul the 300-pound stove to high ground. She had been celebrated for 5 minutes. And then her mother had seen the state of her dress, the mud plastering her arms and face. She had been shamed for unsexing herself, but the miners knew. She had started sewing for them, not the delicate silks the town ladies wanted, but the heavy canvas coats and riveted denim trousers that could withstand the abrasion of the coal face. Her hands, large and calloused, were perfect for driving a heavy-gauge needle through thick canvas. Her strength was not a sin when she was hauling bolts of fabric or 50-pound sacks of coal to her own small room. Her big body, as the men in Juniper Crossing had called it, was not a moral failing. It was a tool. It was capital. It was the only thing that had ever reliably earned her keep. Her gaze drifted from the endless prairie to the man beside her. She found herself studying his equipment. Her eyes, trained by a lifetime of assessing craft, cataloged the wear. His saddle, thrown in the wagon bed behind them, was a mess. It was a good brand, a solid Western stock saddle, but it had been poorly repaired. The stitching on the cantle binding was uneven, pulled too tight in one spot and dangerously loose in another. She could see where the stirrup leather had been reattached with a rivet that was already rusting, weakening the hide. It was the work of a man who was exhausted, who had no one to help him, who was making do with gut and wire instead of proper sinew and beeswaxed thread. Her hands, resting in her lap, began to itch. It was the familiar, restless itch of a craftswoman seeing a job done badly. As if feeling her gaze, Rafe finally spoke. His voice was quiet, nearly carried away by the wind. It's not an easy place. The Blue Mesa. Lydia pulled her attention from the failing saddle. I didn't expect easy. Mr. Calder, just Rafe. He said. He pointed with his chin toward the purple hills. My great-aunt is there. And my nephew, Benno, he's 7. That's the whole crew. Used to have 2 hands, but they drifted south when the pay got thin. He paused, the springs squealing as they hit a rut. The land is good, but the water isn't. Not without the Tamarack ditch. He looked at her then, his gaze direct. There's a man in town, Clive Mercer. He's been buying up the water rights. He's got the bank in his pocket, and he's trying to buy the Tamarack. It's an old irrigation ditch. Feeds 6 ranches. Mine is the last one on the line. If he gets it, he dams it. And if he dams it, my herd dies. I lose the ranch by spring. Here it was. The truth. He was desperate. Lydia felt the old, familiar knot of caution tighten in her stomach. She had been hired out of desperation before, and it often soured when the immediate crisis passed. Mr. Calder, Rafe, she said, her voice firm. I need to be clear. I am a good seamstress. I am a fine leather worker. I am not afraid of hard work, but I am not looking for charity. I am not a project. She met his eyes. I need honest work, for honest pay. If you're offering me a home out of pity for what happened in town, I'd rather you let me off here. Rafe stared at her for a long moment. A flicker of something not offense, perhaps surprise, moved in his eyes. Then he nodded. A slow, respectful gesture. I told you, ma'am, I don't deal in fairy tales, and I don't deal in pity. Pity doesn't put a roof up or keep a herd alive. He looked back at the road. The offer is $3 a week, plus room and board. You'll have your own room off the main house. You'll get 3 hot meals a day, and you'll have my respect. That's the contract. You do the work, you get the pay. You don't, you're free to go. Lydia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. $3 a week was fair. The meals were a bonus. The respect, that was priceless. Then we have an accord. Rafe, she said. He simply nodded again, and the wagon rolled on, the silence returning. but its quality had changed. It was no longer taut. It was settled. It was the quiet of an agreement made. They arrived hours later, as the sun was beginning to dip, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of apricot and blood orange. The blue mesa spread was nestled in a shallow bowl of land, protected from the worst of the wind. The ranch house was small, built of timber and sod, looking more grown from the earth than built upon it. The barns were leaning, the fences were patched. It was exactly as he had described, hanging on by a thread. An old woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes as bright as obsidian stood on the porch. A young, thin-limbed boy, half hidden behind her skirts. Rafe pulled the team to a halt by the kitchen door. "We'll get your trunk inside." He hopped down and moved to the back of the wagon. Lydia was beside him in an instant. Before they unloaded her trunk, they had to move a large water barrel that was blocking it. It was a 40-gallon cask, half full and heavy. Rafe grabbed one side, his good left arm taking the strain. Lydia saw the muscles in his forearm bunch. He was strong, but the angle was awkward. Without a word, she moved to the other side of the barrel, planted her feet, and took her grip on the rough wooden staves. On 3, he said, "I'm ready now," she replied. They lifted together. Their rhythm was immediate, unspoken. They were both used to labor, to the physics of moving heavy, unwilling objects. They swung the barrel off the wagon bed and turned to carry it to the kitchen porch. The space was narrow, between the wagon wheel and the water trough. As they pivoted, Rafe took a step back, and his shoulder, hard and warm through the thin canvas of his shirt, brushed against hers. It was not a romantic touch. It was not a caress or an embrace. It was the simple, functional contact of two people engaged in a shared task. But it was the first time in Lydia's life a man had touched her with strength that matched her own, not in violence or in mockery, but in partnership. A jolt, sudden and sharp as a static spark, shot through her. It was warm. It was alarming. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a half-second, her grip faltered. She looked down at the barrel, her heart giving a strange, unfamiliar lurch. She was almost certain she felt him tense beside her, his own rhythm stuttering for just one beat. Then the moment passed. They set the barrel down on the porch with a solid, definitive thump. Rafe cleared his throat and stepped back, putting distance between them. He did not meet her eyes, but she saw a faint flush of red on his neck, just above the collar of his shirt. "Auntie Ione." "Benno," he said, his voice a fraction rougher than before. "This is Miss Lydia Hale. She'll be staying with us, working with us, far away." In the deep blue dusk of Juniper Crossing, the lamps of the Golden Slipper Saloon cast yellow squares onto the dusty street. In the alley behind the building, where the shadows were thickest, 2 men stood. Clive Mercer, his vest immaculate, held a thin, cream-colored envelope. Sheriff Dobbs, a man whose face had settled into lines of permanent compromise, stood opposite him. Mercer's voice was smooth, bored. "Just a procedural matter. Sheriff, the bank's foreclosure notice on the Tamarack access." Dobbs did not look at the envelope. He looked at the sliver of moon rising over the rooftops. "Calder's got 30 days. By the book. The book can get complicated." Mercer said. He extended the envelope. "Sometimes papers get filed early. Accidents happen. Be a shame if Calder missed his hearing date." Sheriff Dobbs took the envelope. It was thin, almost weightless, but his hand closed around it tightly. He slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. "Accidents do happen," Dobbs agreed, his voice flat. He turned and walked away, the envelope a small, rectangular weight against his chest, disappearing into the growing darkness. Mercer watched him go, a thin smile playing on his lips. The Blue Mesa spread revealed its true self in the sharp, clean light of morning. It was a place built on hope and now maintained by sheer, stubborn grit. The main barn, which should have been the ranch's backbone, listed 5 degrees to the north, propped up by a desperate-looking lattice of lodgepole pine. The tin roof on the house was a patchwork map of rust and silver, held down in places by large rocks. The fences were a history of repairs, old pine, new aspen. And in several places, loops of frayed rope where the wood had run out entirely. It was a ranch holding its breath. On the porch, a figure sat in a high-backed rocking chair, perfectly still. This was Mabel Ione Red Willow, Rafe's great-aunt. She was Shoshone, a woman who had seen the land before the fences, and her presence was as much a part of the ranch as the mesa itself. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her white hair parted in 2 severe braids, her eyes, dark and sharp, missed nothing. She watched Lydia step out of the small, clean room that was now hers. She did not smile, but she did not frown. She simply observed a small boy. All sharp elbows and oversized flannel shirt peered from behind the doorframe. He had Rafe's quietness, but none of his stillness. His curiosity was a vibration. This was Benno, Rafe's nephew, the son of his dead brother. Lydia nodded to the old woman. "Ma'am?" Auntie Ione inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, not necessarily of welcome. That had to be earned. Lydia began as she was bid. The kitchen was her first domain. She stoked the wood stove, her movements economical and sure, a skill learned from 1,000 cold Pennsylvania mornings. She hauled water, scrubbed the pine table, and found the meager sack of flour. By noon, the house smelled of baking soda biscuits and strong, bitter coffee, a smell of order and function it had not known in months. But all morning, her eyes kept drifting to the porch. There sat the casualties of Rafe's losing battle, the broken saddle she had seen in the wagon, a pair of boots worn through at the sole, a tangle of harness straps with cracked leather and missing buckles. When the kitchen was clean, the bread was cooling, and the beans were simmering. She dried her hands on her apron. She walked onto the porch, picked up the saddle, and ran her thumb over the failed, sloppy stitching on the cantle. It was an insult to the leather. She went to her sea-green trunk. She did not pull out dresses or bonnets. She pulled out a heavy canvas roll, which she undid to reveal a gleaming set of tools, steel awls with polished wooden handles, a sharp, curved skiving knife, a block of dark beeswax, heavy needles of varying sizes, and spools of thick, waxed linen thread. She did not ask permission. She sat on the porch step, laid the saddle across her knees, and, with her knife, began to patiently, carefully, cut away all of Rafe's failed, hurried repairs. Benno crept out, his bare feet silent on the boards. He sat 5 feet away, watching her. He watched for almost an hour. Her hands were mesmerizing. They were not the quick, nervous hands of the women he knew. They were slow, powerful, and deliberate. The needle did not slip. The awl did not waver. She punched a new line of holes, her rhythm steady as a clock, and began the 2-needle saddle stitch, a process that locked every single loop, making a seam stronger than the leather itself. "What's that for?" Benno finally whispered, his shyness overcome by his curiosity. Lydia did not look up, but her voice was low and kind. "It's a stitch. You use 2 needles. That way, if one thread breaks, the other one holds. It keeps the rider from falling." She finished the line, pulled the threads tight, and set the saddle down. She picked up a piece of thick scrap leather and a small, hand-held punch. She handed them to Benno. "You try." His eyes widened. He took the tools as if they were made of glass. He tried to push the punch through the leather, his small face turning red with effort. "Not with your arm," Lydia said softly. "Use your body. Put your weight into the tool." She gently placed her hand over his, guiding him. "There, now. Slow and sure. Don't rush the hole. Every stitch is a promise. It promises to hold. You have to make the hole right, so the promise can be kept." Benno's brow furrowed in concentration. He pushed. The punch went through with a satisfying pop, a perfect, clean hole. A slow, proud smile spread across his face, and he looked up at her, his shyness gone, replaced by the bright, clear look of a student. That evening, Auntie Ione sat in her rocker while Lydia, her large-scale repairs done, worked on a simple bridle, rubbing linseed oil into the dry, thirsty leather. The sun was setting, bleeding purple and orange into the dust. "You build walls with work," Auntie Ione said. It was not a question. Lydia paused, her hands slick with oil. She looked at the old woman, whose gaze was fixed on the endless horizon. Lydia thought of the men in Juniper Crossing, of the whispers in Pennsylvania. She smiled, a small, tired smile. Because the wind here is strong. Ma'am. Auntie Ione gave a single, slow nod. The wall had been acknowledged, and, perhaps, respected. The next day, Rafe was in the main corral. He was working with a 2-year-old dun colt, a horse with good lines but a panicked, jumpy energy. Rafe was a good horseman, but his patience was worn thin by debt and drought. He moved too quickly, his frustration telegraphing down the rope, and the colt just danced sideways, snorting, its eyes wide with white. "Settle, damn you," Rafe muttered, giving the rope a sharp, angry tug. The colt reared, fighting the pressure. Lydia came and leaned on the fence. She did not say anything. She just watched. She watched the horse's ears, the tension in its shoulders. She watched Rafe's hard, set jaw. After another 10 minutes of the useless, escalating fight, Rafe saw her. He stopped, breathing hard, and angrily wiped the sweat and dust from his face with his forearm. What he snapped, his pride stung. "You a horsebreaker?" "Too no," Lydia said, her voice calm and even, cutting through his anger. "I'm not a breaker. Let me try." He was about to refuse, to tell her to get back to the kitchen or the porch. But he looked at her. Her hands were resting on the top rail. Steady. Capable. The same hands that had rebuilt his saddle, that had taught his nephew. He looked at the colt, who was trembling. He was failing. He spat in the dust. "Be my guest." He unclipped the rope and stalked out of the corral, leaving the gate open just a crack for her. Lydia slipped inside. She did not have a rope. She did not have a whip. She simply stood in the center of the round pen. The colt snorted and ran to the far side, watching her. She did not look at it. She stood, her shoulders relaxed, her hands at her sides. She seemed to be studying the dirt. After a full minute, she took a slow step, not toward the horse, but sideways, on a circle. She murmured a low, tuneless sound, the same sound she used when she was concentrating on a difficult stitch. The colt's ears swiveled. It watched her. She made no threat. She asked for nothing. She just was. She took another step, still not looking, still humming. The horse, consumed with a predator's prey curiosity, took a hesitant step toward her. It snorted. She paused. She turned her body, presenting her side, not her front, a non-confrontational gesture. Rafe watched from the barn shadows, his anger fading, replaced by a slow, creeping astonishment. She was not breaking the horse. She was inviting it. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of Lydia's patient, circling, quiet presence. Finally, the colt lowered its head, its ears flicked forward, and it walked, slowly, cautiously, right up to her. It stretched out its nose and sniffed her shoulder. Only then did Lydia slowly raise her hand. She did not pat its head. She did not grab. She rested her hand on the colt's solid shoulder, right where she had bumped Rafe. She just held it there, breathing with the horse. Rafe let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He looked at this large, quiet woman who had, in 2 days, brought more function and less chaos to his ranch than he had known in a year. His gaze, which had been hard and assessing, softened. A rider was approaching, coming hard. Both Rafe and Lydia looked up. It was their closest neighbor, a man named Eli Taggart. He pulled his horse up in a cloud of dust, his face gray with defeat. "Rafe," he panted, not even dismounting. "It's over. Mercer's man was at my place this morning. He called in my note." Rafe's face went hard. "You had another month. Eli, Bank says the note was improperly filed," Taggart said, misery in his voice. "They're foreclosing. Or I can sell him my water rights to the Tamarack. That's the offer." He looked at Rafe, his eyes hollow. "I gotta take it. Rafe. I can't lose my land. He's got me." Rafe swore, a sharp, bitter sound. Taggart was the second to last ranch on the ditch. Now, Rafe was the last. He was alone. The word in town, Taggart continued, is that Juniper Crossing is about to get a new owner. Mercer's buying everything, the bank, the land office, even the depot. He shook his head and pulled his horse's head around. You're next, Rafe. I'm sorry. He rode off, a man already defeated. Rafe stared after him, his hands clenched into fists. He walked to the tamarack ditch, a 6-foot-wide channel of packed earth that was the ranch's lifeline. At the top of his property line was the head gate, a simple wooden dam that diverted the water. It was old. The wood was waterlogged and soft. He doesn't even have to buy me out, Rafe said, his voice flat with despair. All he has to do is send one man up here in the night with a shovel. He breaks this head gate. I'm done. My herd is dead in a week. Lydia had followed him. She stood at the edge of the ditch, looking not at the water, but at the structure of the dam. She saw the soft wood, the earth packed around it, the places where the water was already seeping, bubbling through. Back in Pennsylvania, she said, her voice practical, pulling him from his despair. The mining companies had flumes to wash the coal. They leaked, always. Wood rots. I've got no money for new timber, Lydia, and no time to cut it. You don't need new timber, she said. She knelt, grabbing a handful of the supple willow branches that grew thick along the ditch bank. And you don't need nails. Rafe looked at her, confused. You have willow, she said, bending a switch to show its flexibility. And you have cows. I need 3 fresh hides. And the tallow from the kitchen. She looked at the head gate, her mind working, seeing the stitches, the seams, the structure. We can weave a frame of green willow, like a giant basket, inside the old one. Then we stretch the green hides over it, tallowed and sealed. When it dries, it will shrink. It will become as hard as iron and waterproof as a boot. It's an old way, but it works. Rafe stared at her. It was a crazy idea. It was part boat building, part basket weaving, part leather work. It was nothing he had ever heard of. He looked at her hands, still holding the willow branch. He looked at the quiet confidence in her eyes. He thought of his saddle, now stronger than the day it was made. He thought of the colt, now resting its head on her shoulder. He had no other options. His way was failing. Try it, he said, the first true spark of trust, born not of words or promises, but of good, solid work, passed between them. It was more real than any contract. The church in Juniper Crossing was the only building for 50 miles that had ever known white paint. It stood at the end of the dusty main street, its steeple a stark, hopeful finger pointing at the sky. Tonight, the windows glowed. Inside, the hard wooden pews were scraped back against the walls. Opening the center of the room, the air was heavy and warm, thick with the scent of baked apples, strong coffee, and the sweet, resinous smell of the pine floorboards that had been scrubbed with lye soap, paper lanterns, painted with crude sunflowers by the preacher's children, hung from the rafters, casting a soft, forgiving yellow light. This was the annual harvest fundraiser, the single most important social event of the year. It was the one night the ranchers from the high country, the merchants from the town, and the hands from the depot all mingled. A long table groaned under the weight of pie's apple, peach, bean, and vinegar. In the corner, a trio of musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a harmonica were tuning their instruments, the discordant sounds adding to the happy, anxious din. Rafe Calder, Lydia Hale, Auntie Ione, and Benno arrived as a group. Their entrance caused a noticeable lull in the conversation. Auntie Ione, wrapped in her best blanket, was a respected and feared figure, but she rarely came to town. Benno, scrubbed clean, hid behind Rafe's leg. Rafe himself was wearing his one good shirt, mended at the collar and cuff by Lydia's own hands. But the stares were for Lydia. She had done her best. She wore the same buckwheat-colored dress, but she had recut the bodice, using a small piece of saved calico to fashion a more feminine, modest neckline. She had washed her hair, and it shone a deep, healthy brown, pulled back in its simple, severe knot. She wore no paint, no powder, But even in the forgiving lantern light, she was what she was, a large woman, solid and tall, her hands roughened by work, her face browned by the sun. She felt the stares, the familiar assessment. She felt, as she always did, like a draft horse in a room built for ponies. A woman with hair like pale corn silk and a dress of expensive green muslin detached herself from a group of merchants and glided toward them. This was Celine Ward, owner of the town's fabric and dry goods emporium. She was the arbiter of fashion and the standard of town beauty, delicate and fine-boned, with a waist that looked perpetually corseted. She had, for a few months last year, set her sights on Rafe Calder, admiring his quiet intensity. But she had also assessed his failing ranch, his leaning barn, and his stubborn refusal to sell out. Poverty, in Celine's ledger, was a more grievous sin than bad manners. "Rafe," she said, her voice a sweet, high trill. She ignored Lydia completely. "We were all so surprised to hear you'd taken on help." Her eyes finally slid to Lydia, and her polite smile tightened, becoming a thin, sharp line. It was a smile like the edge of a new knife. She looked Lydia up and down, from her functional boots to her unadorned hair. The assessment was swift and brutal. This was the help. This was what the once proud Calder Ranch had been reduced to. The insult was clear. Rafe had chosen this large, plain creature over the possibility, however remote, of her. "Miss Ward," Rafe said, his voice flat. He put his hand gently on Benno's shoulder, steering his small family unit toward the punch bowl, leaving Celine standing alone, her smile now fixed and brittle. The music started, a fast, scraping reel, and the floor filled with stomping boots and twirling skirts. Lydia stood near the pie table, accepting a cup of watered-down punch. She watched. She saw the social rules she had never learned, the easy laughter, the flirtatious glances. She felt a familiar, dull ache. Then, the music stopped. The preacher, Reverend Bly, climbed onto the small platform. "Friends, neighbors," he boomed. "It is time for the highlight of our evening, the raffle dance. Gentlemen, a chance to partner the finest flower of Juniper Crossing ladies. Make sure your names are in the basket." Celine Ward, her composure restored, moved through the room with a woven basket, collecting the folded slips of paper with the women's names. The men, hooting and shoving, lined up to pay their 2 bits for a ticket from a separate hat. The whispers started immediately, a low, cruel hum beneath the shuffling of feet. "God, I hope I don't draw the big one. Huo, Calder's new hired hand. She'd break a man's ankle. Shay says she's strong as an ox." Who'd want to dance with that? Lydia heard every word. It was the boardwalk all over again. Her face began to burn. She set her punch cup down, her hands shaking just slightly. She began to back away, planning to slip out the side door, to wait in the wagon. The air in the room was too thick. She could not breathe. "Oh, Miss Hale, you must join us." Celine's voice was bright and false, right at her elbow. "Every lady must put her name in. It's for the church." Before Lydia could protest, Celine was scribbling on a slip of paper and dropping it into her basket. Celine turned, moving back toward the center of the floor. As she passed, she seemed to stumble on the hem of her own fine dress. "Oh, my heavens!" she cried out, lurching. Her hand, the one not holding the basket, flew out, ostensibly to catch her balance. It did not find the wall. It found the simple, dark brown leather sash Lydia wore around her waist, the one thing that gathered the rough-spun fabric and gave her dress a modest shape. Celine's fingers snagged the sash, and with a sharp, decisive tug, she pulled it clean off. The simple knot gave way instantly. The leather belt fell to the floor. Lydia's dress, cut for work and movement, suddenly hung loose. Without the sash to hold it, the fabric gapped, and the modest neckline she had so carefully sewn sagged forward, dropping a crucial, indecent inch. It did not expose her, but it left her undone, disheveled. Her chemise was visible. A man in the back brayed, a laugh like a donkey. "Look out, she's comin' loose." The laughter that followed was not a titter. It was a roar, It exploded from the crowd, sharp and merciless, echoing off the wooden walls. It was the sound of a public, delightful humiliation. Lydia froze. Time stopped. She could feel the cool air on her skin, see the blur of laughing, pointing faces. Her face was scalding hot, then impossibly cold. Her hands flew up to her chest, fumbling with the loose fabric, trying to pull it back up, trying to cover herself. She was clumsy, panicked, her fingers trembling, unable to fix what had been so quickly broken. The laughter was still peaking when Rafe Calder moved. He had been standing by the door, watching. He did not charge. He did not yell. He crossed the room in 3 long, unhurried strides that parted the crowd like a ship's bow. The laughter faltered as he moved, people turning to see what he would do. He reached Lydia. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her panicked, burning face. He simply stepped in front of her, shielding her from the room. He was wearing his trail coat, an old, oiled canvas thing, but he had brushed it clean for the dance, in one smooth, economical motion. He shrugged his shoulders, and the coat slid from his arms. He did not try to fix her dress. He ignored the problem of the sash. He simply took the coat and wrapped it firmly around her waist, covering the gapping fabric, covering her trembling hands. He pulled the 2 sides snug. Then, with a few deft, powerful movements, he tied the canvas sleeves in a knot at her front. It was not a bow. It was a knot she recognized, a packer's knot, a knot that would not slip, would not loosen, would not fail. The room was now dead silent. The fiddler's hand was frozen above his strings. Rafe secured the knot, giving it a final, firm tug. His coat was now her shield. He stepped back. He looked at her, and only at her. Her eyes, wide and bright with unshed tears, were locked on his chest. "Miss Hale," he said. His voice was not loud, but in the absolute stillness, it carried to every corner. He held out his bare, calloused hand. "They are having a raffle dance," he said, his gaze steady. "But I seem to have drawn the luckiest ticket tonight." Lydia stared at his outstretched hand. She was breathing in short, sharp gasps. "Rafe, I can't," she whispered, her voice thick, broken. "I don't know how. They're all watching." "Let them watch," he said, his voice low and for her alone. He did not move his hand. "Will you dance with me?" "Lydia." She looked at his hand. It was the hand that had offered her a job, the hand that had lifted the water barrel with her. It was steady. It was real. She took a shaky breath and put her hand in his. He did not yank her. He drew her gently but inexorably forward, onto the empty center of the dance floor. He turned to the stunned musicians. "Play a waltz," he commanded, his voice sharp. The fiddler, startled, immediately struck up a slow, hesitant tune. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Rafe pulled her into the formal dance hold. His left hand was warm and firm on her back, resting on the canvas of his own coat. Her first step was a clumsy stumble. She stepped on his boot. Panic seized her again. "I told you," she gasped, trying to pull away. He held her firm. He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, until she could feel the solid warmth of his body. "Stop," he whispered, his mouth near her ear. "You're listening to them." She froze. "Stop listening to the voices," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Listen to the music. That's all there is, just the music. Put your feet on the notes. Step to the music, not to them." She looked up at him. His face was granite, his gray eyes fixed on hers. He was not rescuing her. He was centering her. He was her partner. She took a breath. 1, 2, 3. She heard the fiddle. 1, 2, 3. She heard the guitar. She let go of the laughter, of the humiliation. She stepped. He stepped with her. Her next step was cleaner. The one after that, surer. She was a strong woman, and she had a natural, powerful sense of balance. He was a solid, balanced man. They were not graceful. They were not the floating, spinning couple from a Boston ballroom. They were two strong, capable people, moving as one. They were solid. They were unbreakable. They turned, slowly, surely, in the center of the floor. Alone. The silence of the room held. The whispers were dead. The men who had laughed now studied their boots with great interest. The women looked at each other, their expressions a mix of shock and a new, grudging respect. From her chair by the wall, Auntie Ione watched, her dark eyes missing nothing. She saw the set of her nephew's jaw. She saw the way the large woman moved with him, finding her footing. She nodded. Once, a deep, satisfied gesture. Celine Ward stood by the raffle basket, her face a mask of pale fury. Her plan had not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. She had tried to expose Lydia as a clumsy, overgrown buffoon. Instead, she had handed Rafe Calder a stage, and he had used it to wrap Lydia in his own coat and claim her, publicly and definitively, as the best partner in the room, in the shadows near the back door. Clive Mercer watched the entire drama unfold. He did not clap when the music finished. He did not smile at Celine's humiliation. He observed he had watched Calder, a man he had dismissed as a stubborn, failing homesteader. He saw the way the man had moved, the cold, decisive way he had taken control. He saw the look in the big woman's eyes as she danced with him. This was not a hired hand. This was an ally. This was a spine. Mercer had assumed Calder was a man with nothing left to lose. He saw now that Calder had just found something he would fight to keep. A man who was desperate was brittle. A man who had found hope was dangerous. Mercer realized, with a cold, clear clarity, that his plan to simply squeeze Rafe Calder out was too slow and too subtle. Harassment would not work. He needed to break him. But a fist fight would make Calder a local martyr. He needed something cleaner. He needed paper. He needed the law. He slipped out of the hot, crowded church into the chill of the night. Sheriff Dobbs was outside, smoking a cigar, his back to the music. A touching scene. "Sheriff," Mercer said, his voice smooth as he stepped into the moonlight. Dobbs grunted. "Not turning?" "What do you want?" "Mercer, I'm just a concerned citizen." "Dobbs," Mercer said. "All pleasantness. I've been reviewing the county filings, that water access for the Tamarack ditch. It all seems highly irregular. I'm worried, mister. Calder's claims might not be sound." Dobbs took a long, slow pull on his cigar, the end glowing red in the dark. He knew perfectly well what this was. The envelope in his pocket felt heavier. Calder's family has worked that ditch for 20 years. And for 20 years. "They may have been trespassing on county access land," Mercer replied. "It would be a terrible shame. But it's your duty to investigate. An official inspection of the head gate, the property lines. Make sure his paperwork is all in order." Dobbs sighed, a thin stream of smoke escaping his lips. "You're pushing him." "Mercer, I'm ensuring the integrity of the law. Sheriff," Mercer said. He smiled, though Dobbs couldn't see it. "How about next week, say, Monday, an official notice, posted on his gate? A man gets nervous when he sees an official notice. He makes mistakes." Dobbs was silent for a long moment. He looked at the church, at the yellow light, and the dancing shadows. Then he looked at the ground and dropped his cigar, crushing it under his heel. "Monday," he said, his voice dead. "I'll schedule the inspection for Monday next." The official notice from Sheriff Dobbs had been nailed to their gatepost for 2 days. It was a single white square of paper, stark against the weathered pine. An omen. The inspection was set for Monday. This was Saturday. The day dawned wrong. The sky was a hard, metallic blue, completely clear, but the air was heavy, thick, and hot. It was a suffocating wet heat that felt borrowed from a southern swamp. By noon, the air was dead still. No wind, not even a breeze. The silence was eerie, more unsettling than the constant prairie gales. The horses in the corral stood with their heads low, tails limp, their flanks dark with sweat. Lydia was in the barn, double-stitching a new lead rope, the waxed thread pulling stiffly in her damp hands. Rafe was on the porch, staring at the white paper on the gatepost as if he could burn it with his eyes. Benno and Auntie Ione were inside, trying to escape the oppressive stillness. Around 2 in the afternoon, the change came. It did not come gradually. A shadow, moving at the speed of a running horse, fell across the ranch. Lydia looked up from her work. To the west, a wall of cloud had risen from the earth to the heavens. It was not white or gray. It was a churning, bruised mass of lead and sickly green. The first gust of wind hit the barn like a solid punch, rattling the loose tin roof. It was not a hot wind. It was instantly cold. Rafe, Lydia shouted, dropping her work and running outside. Rafe was already moving, his eyes on the herd. The cattle, grazing a half-mile away in the north pasture, had lifted their heads. They were unsettled, milling, their bodies tight with panic. Then the sound began. A low, distant roar, like 1,000 freight trains, growing louder every second. The herd, Rafe yelled, sprinting for his horse, which was already saddled. "It's Hale. We have to get them into the lee of the mesa." Lydia didn't hesitate. She ran to the corral, threw a bridle on the young dun colt the one she had gentled, leaped onto its bare back, and grabbed a coil of rope from a fence post. She was riding a second after Rafe. The first stones hit as they cleared the gate. They were the size of marbles, hitting the dry ground with sharp, cracking sounds. The air temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The herd heard the roar and felt the first impacts. Their unease exploded into blind, collective terror. As one, the mass of animals turned and ran, but they ran the wrong way. Driven by the wind and the pain, they turned east, away from the protective curve of the mesa. They ran directly toward the ranch's most dangerous boundary, Devil's Notch, a deep, sheer-sided arroyo that cut a 100-foot gash in the prairie. If the herd went over that edge, the Blue Mesa spread was finished. No Rafe roared into the wind. "Head them off. Turn them." He spurred his horse, galloping flat out, trying to get in front of the stampede. Lydia rode wide on his flank, the dun colt running with a panicked, choppy stride. The Hale was larger now, the size of hen's eggs, driven by a horizontal wind. It struck like gunfire. It hammered Lydia's back and shoulders, raising welts through her dress. It cut the horse's hides. Rafe pushed his mount, a seasoned bay, to its absolute limit. He was just managing to get to the head of the lead steers, screaming and waving his hat, trying to turn them. The ground was slick, the grass flattened by the icy barrage. To see the horse slip, it was a dreadful, slow motion unfolding. The bay's back legs went out from under it on the muddy, ice-covered ground. The horse went down, not in a roll, but in a heavy, crashing fall, its full weight landing on Rafe's right side. Lydia screamed his name, but the sound was stolen by the wind. Rafe was thrown clear, but he hit the ground with brutal force. He rolled, his right arm trapped beneath him at an unnatural angle. He tried to push himself up, and his face went white. His right arm was useless, hanging limp from a shoulder that was clearly no longer in its socket. The herd, leaderless, thundered past him. Straight for the notch, Lydia pulled the dun to a halt. For 1 second, she was torn. Rafe or the herd, him or their entire future. Rafe, seeing her hesitation, bellowed at her, his voice tight with agony. The herd. Lydia saved the herd go. She turned. She could not outrun them. She could not get in front of them. She had to think. She remembered her father's forge, how he'd use a curved trough to channel water. She couldn't stop them, but maybe she could steer them instead of riding at them. She rode with them, on their left flank. She uncoiled her rope, not to lasso, but to use its length. She tied one end to her waist, the lariat loop. She held the rest of the coil in her left hand. She began to swing the heavy rope, not at the cattle, but beside them, creating a moving, visual barrier. She spurred the colt, pushing into the edge of the herd, forcing the animals closest to her to turn right, pushing them into their neighbors, creating a slow, negative curve. It was working. The line of the stampede was bending, turning, ever so slightly, away from the sheer drop, but it was not enough. They were too close. She needed a bigger barrier. She pulled the dun to a stop, grabbed the hem of her thick wool cloak worn against the morning chill, and now tied behind her, and with a single, powerful rip, tore it from her shoulders. She swung the heavy, dark fabric in her right hand, her rope in her left, a two-sided visual wing. She was a shepherd, a wall, a force of nature meeting another. She plunged back into the herd, the dun screaming in protest, and she beat the air, yelled until her throat was raw, and physically pushed the stampede, beast by beast. Away from the cliff, the lead steers turned, the herd followed. They were no longer running for the notch. They were running in a wide, panicked circle. They were, for now, saved. Lydia turned the colt, her lungs burning, her body a mass of bruises from the ice, and rode back to Rafe. He was on his feet, staggering, his right arm held tight against his chest, his face a mask of gray pain. The hail was turning to a driving, torrential rain. The world was a mess of water and mud. The shoulders out, he grunted as she dismounted. "We have to—" A sound, a low, wet groan, came from the rocks above them. The gully wall, saturated by the sudden downpour, was letting go. A river of mud and rock was slumping toward them. Rafe, move. He tried to run, but his boot was stuck, suctioned in the thick, new mud. He yanked, but it held him. And then the first wave of the slide hit not the big rocks, but a slurry of smaller stones. A single, table-sized slab of granite dislodged, slid, and settled, pinning his left foot to the ground. He cried out, a sharp, choked sound. He pulled, but his foot was trapped. The grinding sound from above grew louder. A much larger section of the cliff was about to go. "It's pinned!" he yelled. "Lydia, get out of here! Run!" Lydia did not run. Her eyes scanned the debris. She saw a thick, long fence post, washed down in the slide. She saw her lariat, still tied to her waist. Physics, leverage. Her father's forge, hauling the stove. She grabbed the post. "Don't move," she shouted. She wedged one end of the thick post under the edge of the rock that pinned him. She looped her rope around the other end, giving her a handhold and more leverage. "This will hurt," she said, setting her feet in the mud. "Just do it." She put her back into it, all her weight, all her strength. She was not just lifting. She was a fulcrum and a lever. The muscles in her shoulders and back burned. The post bowed. The rock did not move. The grinding from above was louder. Dirt and pebbles rained down on them. Again Rafe yelled. Lydia reset her grip, took a deeper breath, and heaved. She let out a guttural roar, a sound of pure, primal effort. The post groaned. The mud sucked at her boots, and the rock shifted. It only moved an inch, but it was enough. Rafe wrenched his foot free, the boot tearing, and he fell backward, scrambling away on his hands and knees just as the second, larger rock boulder dislodged and crashed down, landing exactly where he had been trapped. They lay panting in the mud, the rain pouring over them, gasping for breath, staring at the rock that should have crushed him. A new sound, thin and terrified, cut through the rain. A child's scream. Benno Rafe gasped, lurching to his feet. They ran, splashing and sliding, toward the ranch, the old storehouse. A small sod structure where Benno often played had been hit. The main crossbeam, rotten with age and soaked by the rain, had shifted, and the roof had partially caved in. Benno was inside, trapped. A heavy waterlogged pine beam lay across the doorway, blocking his exit. He was crying, his small face pale with terror. "Benno, stand back," Rafe yelled. He grabbed the beam with his good left hand, but he had no leverage. His injured shoulder screamed, and he sagged against the wall. Useless. Lydia pushed him aside. "Get ready to pull him." She turned her back to the beam, ducked under it, and braced her shoulders against the rough, wet wood. She was built for this. She was the anvil. She planted her feet. Now. Lydia straightened her legs. She lifted. The beam was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of sod and soaked timber. Her vision swam. Black spots danced. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her knee, but the beam was moving. It was lifting, inch by inch, off the door frame. "I have it," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Get him, Rafe." His face contorted, slid in under the beam beside her, grabbed Benno around the waist, and dragged the boy out into the rain. "I have him, Lydia. Let it go." Lydia shoved herself backward, falling out of the doorway as the beam crashed back down, sealing the storehouse completely. The storm was passing. The rain softened. The hail stopped. The herd was bunched and shivering in the pasture. A few were limping, bruised, but none were lost. Rafe, Lydia, and Benno stood in the mud, soaked to the bone, shaking. That night, the small kitchen was warm. The fire in the stove crackled, a cheerful, defiant sound. Benno was asleep, wrapped in 3 dry blankets. Auntie Ione sat in her rocker, stitching a cut on Rafe's hand. Lydia, having changed into her only other dress, was kneeling in front of Rafe. His shoulder was clearly dislocated, a hard, unnatural lump against the line of his shirt. "Auntie Ione can't get the leverage," Lydia said, her voice quiet. "I can—" Rafe looked at her. His face was pale, lined with pain. He trusted her. He nodded. "It will hurt," she warned. "It hurts now," he grunted. "Bite this," she said, handing him a folded piece of clean leather. He put it between his teeth. She placed one hand on his chest to hold him steady. She gripped his arm just above the elbow. "Auntie Ione, hold him flat," she ordered. The old woman put her hands on Rafe's good shoulder. "On 3, Lydia said. 1, 2, on 2. She pulled, a smooth, brutal, downward and outward traction, followed by a quick rotation. Rafe roared into the leather. His entire body went rigid. There was a sickening, wet thump as the bones seated. Rafe sagged, his head dropping, sweat pouring down his face. He spat the leather out. He breathed, deep and ragged. He slowly, painfully, tried to move his arm. It held. Lydia sat back on her heels, her work done. Later, Benno and Auntie Ione were asleep. The ranch was silent, save for the dripping rain. Lydia sat at the table, staring into the low fire. Rafe sat opposite her, his arm in a sling she had fashioned from a flour sack. Lydia was holding a cup of coffee, but she was not drinking. Her hands, the big, capable hands that had stitched and lifted and fought, were shaking. It was not a violent shake, but a fine, uncontrollable tremor. The adrenaline, the day's terror, was finally leaving her body. She tried to hide it, clasping her hands together in her lap. But Rafe saw. He said nothing for a long time. Then, he reached across the small table with his good left hand. He did not pat her. He did not stroke. He simply laid his hand over hers, covering them, stilling their tremor with his own solid warmth. His hand was calloused and rough, but his touch was unbelievably gentle. Lydia's breath hitched. She looked up at him. His gray eyes were fixed on her, and in their depths was a raw, unfiltered mix of awe and gratitude. "My father built this ranch with his backbone," Rafe said, his voice low and rough. "He always said a place is only as strong as its spine." He held her gaze. "Today, Lydia, you are the backbone of this ranch. You are the spine for all of us." Lydia could not speak. She could not look away. The tremor in her hands stopped, replaced by the steady, pulsing warmth of his. They sat there for a long time, in the quiet kitchen, the firelight flickering in their eyes, the storm finally, truly, over. The next day was Sunday, a day of unnatural, heavy quiet. The sky was scrubbed clean by the storm, but the ground was a wreck of puddled mud, broken branches, and ice melt. It was the day before the inspection, and the silence in the small ranch house was thick with dread. Rafe had spent the morning trying to reset a fence post with his left hand, a futile, infuriating exercise. He came into the kitchen near noon, his face dark with frustration and pain. His right arm, wrapped tightly and secured in the flour sack sling, was throbbing. A useless, heavy weight. He was caked in mud, his shirt soaked with sweat. He stood by the water basin, struggling, grunting as he tried to unbutton his filthy shirt with one hand. The buttons were slick with mud. He swore, a low, vicious sound, and yanked at the fabric, nearly tearing it. "Stop," Lydia said, her voice quiet but absolute. He froze, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was a proud man, broken down by helplessness. Lydia came to him. She did not ask permission. She simply moved into his space, her body close, and began to work on the buttons herself. Her hands were steady. He stood rigid, staring at the wall over her head, his jaw clenched, enduring her help as he would endure a medical procedure. She undid the last button and gently eased the wet, heavy shirt off his good shoulder. Then, with infinite care, guided it over the sling, trying not to jostle the injured joint. He stood bare-chested in the kitchen. The welts from the hail were visible on his skin, dark bruises on the hard muscle of his back and shoulders. "I'll fetch a clean one," she said, her voice practical. She returned from his room with his one good shirt, the one she had mended for the dance. She held it open for him. He slipped his left arm in, and then she stood before him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, and she carefully guided the fabric over his injured arm. The room was small. Her proximity was unavoidable. She had to button it. She started at the bottom, her large, capable fingers moving slowly. She tried to be clinical, focusing on the task, on the small pearl buttons and the stiffly starched holes. But as she moved upward, her knuckles brushed the hard plane of his stomach, and she felt the muscles there clench tight, an involuntary reaction. She reached the top. Her hands were at his throat. The air in the room suddenly felt as thick and hot as it had before the storm. She could smell the lye soap on his skin, and beneath it, the sharp, salty scent of the man himself. As she fumbled with the collar button, her fingers, calloused from the leatherwork, brushed the warm, exposed skin of his neck. Rafe stopped breathing. It was a complete, sudden cessation of air. Lydia's hands froze, her fingers resting against the pulse that beat, strong and rabbit-fast. In his throat, she could feel his life, right there under her skin. She did not pull away. He did not move. He was staring at her, his gray eyes dark, no longer angry, but filled with a raw, desperate intensity. She finally secured the button. Her own breath caught in her chest. She let her hands fall, but she did not step back. The air between them was electric, a palpable thing. The wind picked up outside, scraping a loose branch against the wooden wall. The sound was like a low, distant drum. Inside, the kitchen was warm, smelling of the pine burning in the stove and the faint, comforting scent of the leather and oil from her work corner. "Sheriff Dobbs comes tomorrow," Rafe said, his voice a low rasp. He had not moved. "We are ready for him," Lydia replied. Though her voice was not as steady as she wanted, the headgate held. "Your Willow and Hyde dam held. The dam held," he agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "But the ranch won't. I lost Taggart. I'm the last one. Mercer has the bank. He has the sheriff. He has all the paper. He will take this land. Lydia, he will take my brother's boy from me." He looked down at his useless right arm, at the sling she had made. "I'm not enough," he whispered, the confession torn from him. "I fought. I've worked. I've done everything I know, and it is not enough." He looked up at her, his face stripped bare of all its defenses. "I am not enough." Lydia felt his words in her own chest, an echo of a pain she knew too well. "In Pennsylvania," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear her. "They told me I was the opposite." He frowned. "Not understanding. I was always too much," she explained, a bitter memory rising. "Too tall for the parlor, too strong to be delicate. My hands were too big, my shoulders too broad, my opinions. They were too loud. I was always too much, something to be apologized for, something to be worked around." She met his intense gaze, and for the first time in her life, she did not look away. "You are afraid of being not enough. I have spent my entire life being afraid that I am too much for anyone to want." The space between them vanished. The silence was filled with their twin confessions. Rafe lifted his good left hand. He did it slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He did not touch her waist or her arms. He lifted his hand and cupped the side of her face. His palm was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle, reverent. His thumb stroked her cheekbone. "Lydia," he said, his voice thick, "you are not too much. He swallowed, his eyes searching hers. You are everything. You are exactly enough. It was not a question, but his eyes were asking one. She did not turn her head. She did not back away. She leaned into his touch, a small, trusting movement, and her eyes, clear and bright, gave him his answer. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of violence or desperation. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was slow. It was long. It was, above all, respectful. It was the kiss of two people who had been starving and had just been fed. His lips were chapped from the wind, but they were warm, and they were sure. Lydia's hands, which had been clenched at her sides, rose and came to rest on his chest, on the solid, steady beat of his heart. She could feel it. Thump, 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 under her palms. He pulled back, just an inch, his breath warm on her face. His eyes were closed. Rafe, she breathed, her own voice unsteady. He did not reply in words. His good arm slid from her face, around her back, and pulled her closer. It was not a gesture of possession. It was one of support. His hand splayed wide on her lower back, holding her, anchoring her. Lydia let out a breath she had been holding her entire life, and she pressed her forehead against his. She closed her eyes. They stood that way for a long moment, simply breathing each other in. The smell of pine, of leather, of soap, and the salty tang of hope. He kissed her again, and again. The kisses were deeper now, no longer hesitant. They were a discovery. He tasted her, the strength and the sadness in her, and she tasted him, the grit and the fear. His good arm held her tight, and she, in turn, supported him, her strong frame taking his weight as he leaned into her, a complete and total surrender of his pride. Her hands gripped his shirt, her body trembling, not from cold or fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming force of being, finally, wanted, of being just right. The light in the kitchen was fading, turning the room a deep, warm orange. The fire in the stove settled into glowing coals. The wind outside was a lonely cry, but inside, there was only the sound of their breathing. He took her hand, his left and her right, and led her from the kitchen. He did not lead her to her small room off the porch. He led her to his own room, the one that held his parents' bed, the one that smelled of him. He closed the door. The single coal oil lamp on his nightstand cast a flickering, golden light. Through the door, a watcher might have seen the shadows merge. Then, a hand reached out, and the wick was turned down. The light softened, becoming a low, warm glow. And then, with a final, soft sigh, it went out, leaving the room in a private, healing darkness. The next morning, Monday, dawned cold and clear, the day of the inspection. Lydia was in the kitchen first, stoking the fire. The door to Rafe's room opened, and he came out. He had his sling on, his mended shirt buttoned. They looked at each other across the room. There was no shame, no awkwardness. Their body language was easy, settled. He moved to the coffee pot, and with his left hand, poured a cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it. He smiled at her. It was not his grim, tired smile. It was a new, small, genuine smile that lit his gray eyes from within. She smiled back, a quiet, knowing smile that was just for him. The main door creaked open, and Auntie Ione stood there. She had a small pot of willow bark tea in her hand. Her dark, knowing eyes moved from Rafe to Lydia, and back to Rafe. She saw the new lightness in his shoulders. Despite the injury, she saw the settled, calm strength in Lydia's stance. She saw the empty cup beside Lydia's place, and the one Rafe was holding. She said nothing. Her wrinkled face broke into a slow, deep smile. She nodded once, a gesture of profound approval. She placed the pot of tea on the edge of the table, a quiet offering, and turned, leaving them alone in the new day. The fragile peace lasted only a minute. "He will be here by noon," Rafe said, the smile fading, replaced by the grim reality. "We need the paperwork, the land grant, the water filings." "Where are they?" Lydia asked, her mind shifting instantly to the fight ahead. "In my father's desk." He led her to a small, roll-top desk in the corner of the main room. A piece of furniture that had come all the way from Ohio. He pulled a worn leather portfolio from a drawer. Inside were the founding documents of the Blue Mesa spread. Lydia unrolled the official surveyor's map of the Tamarack Ditch. It was dated 1863. It was the document that proved their right to the water. She studied it, her brow furrowed. She had looked at it twice before, but now, after the intimacy, after the storm, she was seeing it with new, sharper eyes. "Rafe," she said, her voice tight. "Come here. Look at this." He leaned over her shoulder, so close she could feel his breath. "What is it?" She pointed to the county clerk's signature at the bottom. "What color is this ink? It's brown. It's old." "No," Lydia said, her voice hardening. She lightly touched the paper. "It's iron Gallic, meant to look old, but look how it's oxidized. It's too uniform. And this," she pointed to the official county seal, pressed into the paper. "The pressure is off. The serrated edge is blurred." She had spent 10 years of her life working with dyes, chemicals, and inks for fabrics and leathers. She knew materials. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a cold, dawning horror. "Lydia, what are you saying? I'm saying this isn't an original from 1863. She said, her voice a grim whisper. "This is a forgery. A very good one. But it's new. Someone switched your map." Rafe's face went pale. "But this is our only copy. The official one is in the ledger at the courthouse. And I will bet my life," Lydia said, her hand clenching on the table, "that the map in the courthouse doesn't match this one. Someone, Mercer, planted this here for you to find. He wants you to bring this to the inspection." Rafe stared at the map. The fraudulent proof of his life. He didn't just buy the sheriff. He swapped the ledgers. He's coming here today not to inspect the ditch. He's coming to arrest me as a fraud. The revelation hung in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. The map was a trap. The inspection was a farce. He planted it, Rafe said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He stepped back from the desk, his good left hand flexing and unflexing. He had someone break in, steal the original, and leave this poison. His eyes went to the Winchester rifle mounted above the fireplace. "I'll meet Dobbs at the gate, but I won't be holding paperwork." "No," Lydia's voice was sharp, cutting through his rage. She put her hand on his good arm, stopping him. "That is what he wants. Rafe, he wants you to be a hothead. He wants you to pull a gun on the sheriff, so they can arrest you or shoot you and call it justice. We will not use his tools." "What other tools are there?" he shot back, his despair making him cruel. "He has the law, he has the bank, and he has our map." "He has a map," Lydia said, her mind racing, her eyes darting around the room. She was a mender, a repairer. She thought in terms of seams, of hidden layers, of what lay beneath. "He switched the map in your father's portfolio. But what else did your father keep? Nothing. That was it, the land grant, the water filings." "No," Lydia insisted, a sudden, fierce energy in her. "Where are the daily records, the ranch ledgers, the books that show the work?" Rafe pointed, frustrated, to a large, battered wooden sea chest in the corner, the one that held his family's history. "In there. But they're just numbers. Lydia, cattle counts, feed purchases." "They're not legal documents. They are proof of life," she said, moving to the chest and throwing open the heavy lid. Inside was a stack of leather-bound ledgers, their covers warped and stiff with age. She recognized them. She had spent an evening last week, when the rain was keeping her inside, assessing them. She pulled out the oldest one, a massive book dated 1860. Its cover was split, the leather flaking. "This one?" she murmured, her fingers tracing the damage. She opened it. Tucked inside the back cover, in a sleeve of oilcloth, was another map. It was not the crisp, clean forgery from the desk. This map was on softer, yellowed paper, cracked at the folds. The lines were drawn in faded brown ink, and the margins were filled with handwritten notes, measurements, and observations. "What is it?" Rafe said, leaning over her. "It's the surveyor's original field map," she whispered, her fingers tracing the lines. "The one he made before he drew up the official copy for the courthouse, Look, your father signed it. And the surveyor. The ink is right. It's faded. It's real. Rafe's heart leaped, but his hope was quickly tempered. It's just another piece of paper. Lydia, Mercer has the official, filed copy in the courthouse ledger. This is just a field map. It proves nothing. It proves everything, she said, her voice vibrating with intensity. She turned the map over and pointed to a tear in the top left corner. The paper had ripped, and it had been mended. The tear was secured by a small, neat patch of dark brown calfskin, stitched through the paper with waxed linen thread. The stitch was a small, precise 2-needle lock stitch. Her signature. I did this, she said, her finger tracing the seam. 6 days ago, when I was cleaning out this chest, I saw the map was torn. I mended it, just as I mended your saddle. This proves this map was here, in this chest, in our possession, long before Sheriff Dobbs ever nailed that notice to our gate. Rafe stared. The forgery was the trap. This mended map was the key. The hearing, he said, the pieces clicking into place. Dobbs's inspection is at noon, but the county docket hearing, the one to ratify the bank's foreclosure, is this morning, in Sagebrush Bluff. At 11, the inspection was a diversion, Lydia said, carefully folding the map. He wanted you here, waiting with a fake map, while he won a default judgment 20 miles away. We ride, Rafe said, all his despair replaced by a cold, hard fury. Now, he grabbed his hat. Lydia grabbed hers. And the precious map, as they burst onto the porch. Auntie Ione was standing there, holding a small, beaded leather pouch. She had heard every word. The horses are ready, she said, her voice calm. I saddled them. She looked at Rafe. You will not go alone. I will take the buckboard. I have my own testimony to give. Auntie, it's too far, too fast. The spirits of the land move faster than a horse. Nephew, she said, her dark eyes sharp, I will be there. She held out the pouch. These are the words from my grandfather, the words that gave your grandfather permission to use the tamarack. The water belongs to the land, not to a man with a pen. Rafe nodded, his throat tight. He and Lydia ran to the horses. Rafe, with his arm in a sling, mounted his bay in a single, awkward, left-handed vault. Lydia swung onto the dun colt. They spurred the horses, galloping out of the yard, leaving Auntie Ione to follow. The ride to Sagebrush Bluff was a flat-out race against the clock. They pushed the horses across the open prairie, the wind whipping their faces, the sun climbing toward its zenith. They had to be at the courthouse by 11. It was already past 10. They were in a dry, open flat, 5 miles from the town, when Lydia saw the dust. 3 riders, to their east, angling to intercept them. Mercer's men, Rafe yelled, seeing them at the same time. He had no way to draw his pistol, and even if he couldn't aim. Ride. Lydia, ride. They pushed the horses to a dead run, but the men were on fresh mounts. They were gaining. One, on a fast pinto, was pulling ahead, his hand on the rifle in his scabbard. He was trying to get a clear shot. Lydia saw him. She reined the dun back a half step, letting Rafe get ahead. She reached into her own saddlebag. Her hand closed around a creation of her own making, a tool from her youth. 3 leather pouches, each stitched tight around a heavy, egg-sized rock. The pouches were tied together with 3 long, perfectly braided leather thongs. A bola. The rider was close now, just 30 yards back. He was fumbling with his rifle, trying to pull it free while riding at a gallop. Lydia pulled the dun to the left. She stood in her stirrups, the bola in her right hand. She began to swing it, a low, whistling circle that built speed with every rotation. 1, 2, 3, with a powerful, forward snap of her entire body. She released it. The bola flew, a spinning, deadly weight, low across the sagebrush. The rider on the pinto saw it too late. The leather thongs wrapped perfectly around the front legs of his charging horse. The pinto went down as if it had been shot, its head hitting the ground in a cloud of dust and a sickening scream. The rider flew over its head, tumbling end over end, and lay still. The other 2 riders, seeing their companion fall, pulled up hard, their horses rearing. They stared at Lydia, now just a distant figure, galloping after Rafe. They were not paid enough for this. They turned and rode back to their fallen man. Dusty Fork Rafe shouted, pointing. It's the only way across the bridge at Dusty Fork was a terrifying, swaying relic of rope and sun-warped planks, strung across a 50-foot deep, dry canyon. It was barely wide enough for a wagon. Rafe pulled his horse to a halt at the edge. The bay snorted, refusing to step onto the shifting boards. "It won't hold both of us," Lydia said, dismounting in an instant. Her mind was all function. "Give me your reins. Lydia, I can—" "You have one arm. Rafe, give me the reins." She grabbed the bridle of his nervous horse. "I'll lead them, one at a time." She stepped onto the bridge. It swayed under her weight. She spoke in a low, calm murmur, the same voice she had used on the dun colt. "Easy, easy, boy, just wood, just walking." She pulled, and the bay, trusting her voice more than its eyes, stepped onto the bridge. She walked backward, never taking her eyes from the horse, as the bridge groaned and swayed under its weight. She reached the far side, her face slick with cold sweat. She handed the reins to Rafe. "Wait here." She walked back across the groaning bridge and returned with her own horse. They were across, but they were not alone. A man on a black gelding sat in the shadow of a cottonwood, blocking the trail. It was Clive Mercer, dressed in his immaculate town suit. He was not armed. He was just waiting. "A remarkable effort," Mercer said, his voice laced with mock admiration. "Truly, the woman is full of surprises." Rafe moved his horse forward, his left hand tight on the reins, his face a mask of stone. "Get out of the way." "Mercer." "Why?" Mercer smiled, a thin, reptilian gesture. "So you can be humiliated in court, so you can be arrested for fraud. I'm offering you a courtesy. Calder, an exit." He held up a single piece of paper. It was the banknote. "This is a simple transaction. You are a rancher. I'm a businessman. I want the tamarack ditch. I don't, in truth, even want your land. It's worthless without the water, as you well know." He extended the paper. "Turn around. Go back to your collapsing barn. Sign this small paper, ceding your water rights, and I will tear up your note. The bank will be satisfied. The sheriff will be recalled. You keep your safe haven." His eyes flicked to Lydia. "You get to be safe." Rafe looked at the paper. He looked at the man who had tried to trap him, to ruin him, who had sent men after him. He looked at Lydia. She was covered in dust, her hair falling from its knot, her face streaked with sweat. She was breathing hard from the run. She looked magnificent. She met his gaze. She did not nod. She did not speak. She simply waited for his answer, her trust in him absolute. He turned back to Mercer. "No." Mercer's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine annoyance. "No, you have a crippled arm. You have a forged map. You have nothing." Lydia urged her horse forward, pulling up beside Rafe. She looked down at the man in the clean suit. She smiled, a small, hard smile that did not touch her eyes. "We'll see you in the courtroom, Mr. Mercer." They spurred their horses, galloping past him, kicking dust onto his polished boots. Mercer sat, stunned, for a second. Then he swore and yanked his own horse around. Racing back toward town, they thundered into Sagebrush Bluff. It was a proper town, with 2-story brick buildings and a wide, paved street. They pulled up in front of the county courthouse, their horses heaving. The clock on the steeple read 10:50. They had 10 minutes. As they dismounted, Rafe grabbing the reins with his good hand. A new sound filled the air. Not the wind. It was shouting. It was the thunder of hooves, many hooves, on the hard-packed street. From a side alley, a small herd of 20 steers burst onto the main street, prodded by 2 men Rafe recognized as Mercer's saloon toughs. The men were firing pistols into the air. The cattle, already panicked, stampeded. People screamed and scattered. A woman with a parasol was knocked down. A vegetable cart overturned, sending apples and cabbages rolling. It was chaos. "It's a diversion," Lydia yelled over the din, grabbing Rafe's good arm. "He's trying to keep us out." To create a panic, the courthouse doors were just 30 feet away. but the street was now a surging, terrified mass of people and panicked livestock. The courthouse square exploded. The cattle, already terrified, struck the vegetable cart, and it shattered, sending apples rolling like billiard balls under their hooves. People screamed, shoving each other, trampling the very parasol the woman had dropped. They ran for doorways, for alleys, for anything that looked solid. The 2 men Mercer had hired kept firing into the air, their shots echoing off the brick facades, adding to the panic, ensuring the herd stayed bunched and chaotic, a living, bellowing wall between Rafe and the courthouse steps. Clive Mercer himself, having spurred his horse ahead, had dismounted and was sprinting up the stone steps, a thin smile on his face. He would be inside. His lawyer would be filing the motion. And the judge, hearing the riot outside, would grant the default judgment just to clear the docket. The chaos was the final part of his plan. Rafe, with his one good arm, fought his horse, the bay rearing as a steer slammed into its flank. He was trapped, 100 feet from the door. Lydia saw it all in a fraction of a second, the stampede. The panicked townsfolk, Mercer disappearing inside. Rafe trapped, but she also saw something else. In the center of the square, near the dry iron fountain, sat the town's fire wagon. It was an old, hand-pumped model, its red paint faded. But on its side, hooked to the frame, was a long, heavy extension ladder. She was not a lawyer. She was not a gunman. She was a problem solver, and the problem was not just Mercer. It was the herd. People were going to be crushed. She ran, not for the courthouse, but for the wagon. She dodged a panicked man, slid on a rolling apple, and grabbed the rungs of the ladder. She did not wait to unhook it. She climbed, hand over hand, scrambling up the side of the wagon itself until she was standing on the high railed platform where the hose operator would stand. She was now 10 feet above the chaos. She could see everything. The herd was milling, confused, a danger to everyone. She needed to move them. She unfastened the heavy wool cloak she still wore from the ride, the same cloak she had used in the storm. She pulled it from her shoulders. Hey-ya, her voice, a parade ground bellow she didn't know she possessed, cut through the noise. Here, here, cattle. She waved the dark cloak, a huge, flapping flag, making herself the biggest, strangest, most threatening thing in the square. A led steer, a big brindle with wide horns, saw her. It snorted, lowered its head, and turned. Lydia flapped the cloak again, shouting. The steer, seeing her as the source of the noise, moved toward her, and the rest of the herd, in their mindless way, began to follow, their bodies flowing like a river. She was drawing them. That's it, she yelled. She flapped the cloak toward the street leading out of town. This way, move. The herd began to pour past the fire wagon, turning away from the courthouse, following the strange shouting woman on the red platform. They thundered around the fountain, avoiding the steps, avoiding the people huddled in the doorways, and began to run, in a column, down the open street and out of town. In less than a minute, the square was clear. It was a wreck of splintered wood and scattered vegetables, but the people were safe. The riot was over. Rafe had watched her, his mouth agape. He saw his opening. He spurred his horse, which leaped over the overturned cart, and galloped up the courthouse steps, pulling the bay to a halt in a clatter of iron on stone. He was just in time to see Clive Mercer, his face pale with rage at this turn of events, try to slip back out of the courthouse, his plan clearly having failed inside. Rafe blocked the doorway, his horse filling the entire arch, going somewhere. Rafe's voice was low, deadly. Mercer stopped, his composure returning. Get out of my way. Calder, you're trespassing on county property. He's not trespassing. Sheriff Dobbs stepped out from behind a pillar. His face was gray and sweaty. He had seen the chaos, seen Lydia's control, seen Rafe's charge. His hand was on the butt of his pistol. He's interfering with a legal proceeding. And you, he looked at Rafe, his voice shaking, are under arrest for assault. Those were my deputies you ran off the road. They were hired thugs. Rafe spat. That's for the judge to decide. Dobbs's hand was shaking. and that made him dangerous. He drew his pistol, the barrel wavering. Now, Calder, get off that horse. Get off it now, or you will do nothing. Sheriff. The voice was not loud. It was ancient. It was cold as the wind off a snowpack. Auntie Ione Red Willow, having left her buckboard down the street, walked up the stone steps. She moved through the center of the standoff, past the trembling barrel of the gun, past Rafe's horse, and stood directly in front of the sheriff. She was a small woman, 100 years old, but she stood with an authority that dwarfed everyone. She looked at the gun in Dobbs's hand. The man who points a weapon in fear is already a dead man. Daniel Dobbs. His spirit has fled. Dobbs flinched, his face paling further. He knew this woman. His father had known her. This is the law. Auntie, this is county business. This, she said, her voice rising just enough to carry, is the land? And I am the land. She turned, and for the first time, addressed Mercer. You, who would poison the water. Your name will be a dry stone in the mouth of our children. The hearing is open. We are going in. She turned, without looking back, and walked into the courthouse. Lydia, having run from the fire wagon, her cloak in her hand, met Rafe at the steps. He dismounted, his good arm looping the reins over the hitching post. He was breathing hard, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Lydia. He didn't need to say a word. They walked up the steps, side by side, and followed his great-aunt into the Hall of Justice. The courtroom was paneled in dark, imposing wood. The clock on the wall read 11:03. The judge, a stern man named Harris, was already on the bench, his face a thundercloud. Mercer and his slick-looking lawyer were at one table. Mr. Calder, Miss Hale. Judge Harris boomed, banging his gavel. You are late, and you are responsible, I take it, for the anarchy in my square, no, Your Honor, Lydia said, her voice clear and carrying. She was covered in dust, her hair falling down, but her back was straight. We were delayed by Mr. Mercer's men, who caused that riot to prevent us from being here. Outrageous, Mercer's lawyer shouted. Accusations without proof, I have proof, Lydia said. She stepped forward and laid the old, leather-bound ranch ledger on the judge's bench. Of everything. The judge opened the book. He saw the faded surveyor's map, the notes, the signatures. This is a field map, Your Honor, Mercer's lawyer sneered. It's meaningless. We have the official filed copy from the county ledger, the only copy that matters. And it shows Mr. Calder's claim is fraudulent. That ledger, Lydia said, was tampered with. Another baseless accusation. Is it, Lydia asked. She pointed to the back of the ledger in the judge's hands, where the oilcloth sleeve was stitched. Your Honor, I am a seamstress. That ledger was falling apart. 6 days ago, I repaired it. That is my stitch. A 2-needle lock stitch with waxed linen thread. A stitch I guarantee you will not find anywhere else in this county. She then placed the other map on the bench, the forgery from Rafe's desk. This, she said, is the map Mr. Mercer's associates planted in our home, hoping we would bring it today. Look at the ink. Your Honor, it is modern iron Gallic, artificially aged with acid. And look at the county seal. The serration is off by 3 teeth. It was stamped with a counterfeit. The judge stared, his eyes widening. He was a man who appreciated craft. He looked at the perfect, strong stitch on the ledger. He looked at the blurry, imperfect seal on the forgery. This is compelling. Miss Hale, he murmured. But the ledger in the county office is also a forgery, Your Honor. A small, terrified voice said from the back of the room. Everyone turned. A young man, barely 20, with ink stains on his fingers and a green visor on his head, was standing by the door. It was Silas, the land office clerk. He was trembling from head to toe. What did you say, young man? The judge demanded. Silas walked forward, his knees shaking. I did it, Your Honor. Mr. Mercer. He came to me last week. He said my father's store owed the bank money. He said he would ruin him. Clive Mercer shot to his feet. "This is a lie. This boy is unstable. He made me." Silas sobbed, tears cutting lines in the dust on his face. "He brought me the new ledger book, already printed. He made me unlock the office at midnight. We swapped them. He made me stamp the new one to make it look official. But I used the wrong date stamp. I used the one from that night, not the one from 1863. I was so scared. It's in there. Your Honor, the wrong date. I couldn't sleep. It was over." The room was silent. The confession, born of pure terror, was irrefutable. Clive Mercer's face was no longer pale. It was a dark, mottled red. His mask of civility was gone. He looked at the clerk, at the judge, at Lydia. He saw the trap, and he saw it sprung. He turned and bolted for the door. Rafe was already there. He had moved the second Mercer stood. He did not have his gun. His right arm was in a sling. He just stood in the doorway, a solid, immovable object. Clive slammed into him. Rafe didn't even flinch. He just absorbed the impact, his good left hand catching Mercer by the front of his expensive vest. He held him, their faces inches apart. "You lost, Mercer," Rafe said, his voice quiet, devoid of anger, full of a cold, final judgment. "You lost the moment you looked at us and thought we were nothing. You lost because you scorned us." He shoved Mercer back into the courtroom, where Sheriff Dobbs, his face the color of ash, slowly, reluctantly, put the handcuffs on him. The judge's gavel struck the bench like a rifle shot. "This court finds that a conspiracy to commit fraud has been perpetrated," he declared. "Mr. Mercer, you are fined $10,000 and will be held for federal trial. Sheriff Dobbs, you are suspended, pending a full investigation into your conduct." He looked at Rafe and Lydia. "The court affirms the original water rights of the Tamarack Ditch, as filed by the late Calder family and authenticated by the Shoshone Tribal Accord." He nodded to Auntie Ione, who had not moved. "The fraudulent deed is hereby nullified. The rights belong to the Blue Mesa Spread and to the community." Outside, the sun was bright. The square was a mess, but the air was clear. As they stepped out onto the stone steps, the townsfolk, who had heard the ruling, began to gather. They were hesitant at first. Then one man, the blacksmith, started to clap. The applause spread. It was not a roar. It was a steady, rolling wave of approval. The people were clapping for the small rancher who had refused to break, and for the big woman who had saved their children from the stampede. Celine Ward stood near her shop, her arms crossed. She watched Lydia Hale, who was standing beside Rafe, her face dirty, her hair a wreck, her dress stained, and she was, Celine realized with a sickening lurch, the most formidable woman she had ever seen. Celine had built her life on being just enough, and here was a woman who was too much, too strong, too smart, too unbreakable, and who had just saved the entire valley. Celine turned and, for the first in her life feeling small and irrelevant, went back inside her shop. Rafe and Lydia stood on the steps, exhausted, bruised, but standing tall. The weight of the past months, the fight, the fear, finally settled. Rafe turned and looked at her. He was not looking at her as a partner, or a savior, or a backbone. The gratitude was there, but it was buried deep beneath something else. It was an echo of the look from the night before, but magnified, stripped of all doubt. His gaze was steady, clear, and full of a quiet, profound question. He was looking at her, Lydia realized, with the terrified, hopeful, and absolute recognition of a man who was looking at the entire rest of his life. The Juniper Crossing town square was unrecognizable. The autumn harvest had come, and the raw, dusty patch of land from the summer was gone. In its place was a celebration. A new, raw pine platform had been erected in the center, paid for by the county and built by the ranchers who, thanks to the Blue Mesa's victory, still had water in their ditches. The air, once tasting of alkali and blood, now smelled of ripe apples, smoked venison, and the clean, sharp scent of sawdust. Trestle tables were laden with quilts, jars of preserves, and wheels of hard cheese. The town was alive. This was the harvest market. but it was also a celebration of their deliverance. And at the center of that celebration stood the family from Blue Mesa. The chatter of the crowd died down as Auntie Ione Red Willow was helped onto the new platform. She did not need the preacher to introduce her. She stood, a small, dark figure against the bright yellow of the new pine, and the entire town quieted, listening. She looked out over the faces. She saw the men who had mocked, the women who had whispered, and the good, solid folk who had been too afraid to speak, and she saw them all, now united. "We are people of the land," she began, her voice thin as a reed but carrying on the crisp air. "The land does not lie, it does not cheat, it only asks for work, it asks for respect, and it asks for what is broken to be mended." Her dark eyes, bright as polished stones, found Lydia, who stood at the edge of the platform with Rafe and Benno. "We were broken," Auntie Ione continued, her gaze holding Lydia's. "Our trust was broken, our laws were broken. Our water was almost broken. We were saved, not by a gun and not by a bank, but by a woman who came here with nothing but her hands and her heart." The crowd was utterly silent. The town saw a worker. Auntie Ione said, "My nephew saw a partner." But the land recognized its own. It recognized a heart that knows how to mend. She mended our saddles. She mended our fences. She mended our courage. She is a daughter of this place, with the hands of a true craftsman and a spirit that stitches things together. She raised her hand, a blessing that was also a pronouncement. "We honor the one who mends." A ripple of applause, deep and heartfelt, spread through the square. Lydia felt a hot flush rise up her neck, but this time, it was not the scalding heat of shame. It was the warmth of belonging. As the clapping subsided, Benno, who had been vibrating with excitement, broke free from Rafe's side. He ran to Lydia, his boots stomping on the new boards. "Lydia! Lydia, I made you something." He was no longer the shy, hidden boy. His face was bright, his eyes clear. He shoved his small, grubby hand toward her. "I did it myself," he said, his voice breathless with pride. "I used the punch, like you showed me." Lydia looked down. In his palm was a small, crude ring. It was a simple loop of dark, oiled leather. The holes he had punched for the sinew thread were uneven, some too close to the edge. One punched clean through the wrong spot. The stitching was clumsy. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "You taught me," he said, his small face serious. "You said, slow and sure. You taught me patience." Lydia felt her throat tighten. A sudden, painful knot of emotion. She knelt, ignoring the crowd, ignoring everything but the boy. She picked up the small, imperfect loop of leather. "Benno," she whispered, her voice thick. "It's perfect. It's the finest stitch I have ever seen." She slipped it onto her large, strong ring finger. "It fit. Now, it's my turn." Rafe's voice, low and resonant, came from behind her. Lydia stood and turned. The crowd gasped. A low, collective "oh." Rafe was not standing there empty-handed. While Auntie Ione had spoken, the blacksmith, the same man who had clapped first in Sagebrush Bluff, had rolled a small, portable forge and his best anvil onto the platform. Rafe was wearing a clean shirt. His right arm, the one injured in the storm, was no longer in a sling, but it was clear he favored it. He walked to the anvil. He was not holding a velvet box. He was holding a hammer and a single, silvered spike pulled from an old horseshoe. He picked up the tongs with his right hand, his grip still stiff, and placed the tip of the spike into the glowing red heart of the forge. The crowd watched, mesmerized. This was not a speech. This was labor. He pulled the metal out, glowing bright cherry red. He laid it on the anvil. He took the hammer in his good, strong left hand. He paused, looked at Lydia, and then he struck clang. The sound was not the sound of the depot sign. It was not the sound of the forge in her father's yard. It was a clear, pure note of creation. Clang, clang, clang. He was awkward, using his left hand for the striker's work, but his swings were sure. He was not a blacksmith, but he was a man who understood metal and force. He was a man making a promise. Sparks flew, disappearing into the bright autumn sunlight. He turned the metal, hammering the square spike into a round, flat band. He was breathing hard, the work a clear effort. He hammered, quenched the metal in the slack tub with a hiss, and then hammered again, shaping the ring, his face a mask of complete, focused intention. He was forging his vow. After 10 minutes, he stopped. He plunged the metal one last time, dried it, and walked toward Lydia, leaving the forge and anvil behind. The ring was not a delicate, polished thing. It was gray steel, hammered and textured, strong, and still faintly warm from the fire. He walked to the center of the platform. He stopped in front of her. The entire town was his witness. "Lydia Hale," he said, his voice clear. He did not just hold out the ring, he dropped, slowly, onto one knee. A collective sigh went through the women in the crowd. He looked up at her, his gray eyes stripped bare, holding nothing back. "I was a man," he said, his voice shaking just once, "who was afraid of not being enough. You were a woman who was afraid of being too much." He took her left hand, the one wearing Benno's leather ring. "Lydia, I need you," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I need you, not just for the incredible strength you have, but for how you use it. You use it to lift everyone around you. You used it to lift this ranch. You used it to lift this town. And you used it to lift me." He held up the simple, heavy, forged ring. "I am not offering an easy life. I am offering my hand and my heart and all of my days. Will you marry me? Lydia Hale." Lydia looked down at him, her vision blurred, the mocking laughter from the boardwalk. "Who'd want to dance with that?" echoed in her memory. A ghost at a feast. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the men who had said it. They were watching, their hats in their hands, their expressions full of awe. She looked back at Rafe, at this strong, quiet man, kneeling in the dust for her. She let out a shaky breath. "Yes," she whispered, the word lost to the air. She cleared her throat and said it again, her voice strong, full of the same certainty as the hammer blow. "Yes, I will." Rafe Calder's face broke into a smile so wide and bright it changed his entire face. He slid the heavy steel ring onto her finger, next to the small leather one. "Huzzah!" a man in the back roared. The word was picked up. It was not a cheer. It was a wave. It was a shout of victory that rolled across the square, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Rafe stood, his hands finding her waist, and he pulled her close. The crowd was whistling and stomping, but they were interrupted. The crowd parted. Celine Ward, her face pale, her green dress seeming less bright than it had before, walked toward the platform. She stopped at the edge, looking up at Lydia. Rafe's hand tensed on Lydia's back. Celine did not look at Rafe. She looked only at Lydia. "Miss Hale," Celine said, her voice quiet but clear. What I did at the church, it was unkind. I was wrong about you." She took a breath. "I am sorry." Lydia looked down at the woman who had tried to break her. She saw no victory, only a small, sad person. Lydia remembered the feeling of the sash being pulled, the scalding humiliation, and then she remembered the feeling of Rafe's coat and the strength of his hand. She gave a single, slow nod. "It's forgotten, Miss Ward." It was not weakness. It was the final stitch. It was the closing of the wound, the end of the last ragged thread. Celine nodded, humbled, and stepped back into the crowd. The fiddler, sensing the moment, leaped onto the platform. "A dance," he shouted. "The first dance for Mr. Calder and the future Mrs. Calder." He put his bow to the strings, and the clear, sweet notes of a waltz filled the air. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It was the same song, the exact same waltz that had played in the church, the night of her deepest humiliation. Rafe looked at her, a question in his eyes. Lydia smiled. She put her hand in his. "I believe," she said. "This is our song." He pulled her to the center of the platform. He put his arm around her waist, his right arm, the one that had been injured, now strong enough to hold her. They began to move. Their first steps at the church had been clumsy, terrified, defiant. Now, they were sure. They moved with a shared, solid grace. They were not two people fighting the world. They were one. Standing at the center of it. They turned, and the crowd clapped in time with the music. They danced, not as a spectacle to be mocked, but as a standard to be honored. The sun was warm, hanging low in the sky, scattering golden dust on the air. The wind was just a soft, gentle breeze, carrying the scent of apples and new-cut pine. Juniper Crossing, a town that had lived on the edge of thirst and despair, felt the rhythm of the waltz, and it seemed to, finally, take a deep, contented breath. They were married a week later, not in the church, but on the land they had saved. They stood under the vast, rustling canopy of the cottonwood trees that lined the tamarack ditch. The water, their water, flowed steadily beside them, a quiet, liquid witness. Reverend Bly presided, but the true blessing was given by Auntie Ione, who stood and spoke of the water, the land, and the joining of two strong spirits. Benno, his face scrubbed clean, served as Rafe's witness, standing impossibly straight and proud. Rafe wore his good shirt, the collar ironed flat, his mended arm strong and steady at his side. Lydia wore a simple dress of cream-colored muslin, a gift from a humbled Celine Ward, but the veil was her own. It was a simple, fine piece of netting, but it was not attached to a band of lace or ribbon. It was secured by a thin, soft strap of white-tanned deer hide, which she had fastened to the netting with a single, perfect, repeating line of 2-needle saddle stitches. It was her craft, her signature, her vow. Life on the Blue Mesa spread settled, but it did not slow. It transformed. The old listing barn, once a symbol of desperation, was now straight and true. Rafe, with the help of Eli Taggart and the other ranchers who now shared the water, had reset the foundations, put on a new roof, and rebuilt the stalls. But one entire side of it, the side that caught the morning light, was not for livestock. It was Lydia's. A new, neatly painted sign hung above the wide door's Calder leather canvas. Repairs custom work. But it became more than a shop. Twice a week, as the sun began to dip, the young men and women of the valley gathered there. They came, not just for mending, but for learning. Lydia, with Benno as her chief apprentice, held classes. She taught them how to tool leather, how to set a rivet, how to waterproof canvas, and, most importantly, how to throw a perfect, unbreakable stitch. She did not teach them a trade so much as she taught them a philosophy. Your two hands, she told them, her large, capable hands resting on a fresh hide, can build or mend or create value from nothing. They do not need to ask permission from the world to be worthy. They just need to do the work. Rafe, for his part, became a leader, not through words, but through action. He called a meeting of the 6 ranches that relied on the tamarack. They gathered, not at the saloon, but around the big kitchen table at Blue Mesa, with Lydia's mended surveyor's map spread between them. They drew up a new water pact. It was not a legal document of angles and clauses, but a community agreement, written in plain English, ensuring fair shares, shared labor for the upkeep, and a reserve for the town itself. When the document was finalized, they did not sign it with pens. They rode, as a group, to the blacksmith's forge in Juniper Crossing. Each rancher, starting with Rafe, took the heavy hammer and struck the anvil once, a resounding, binding clang of steel on steel, sealing their promise to each other. The town, too, was healing. Clive Mercer, his assets frozen, was gone, transported to Cheyenne to await a federal trial. He was a story that was already fading, a bad dream in the daylight. Sheriff Dobbs, facing disgrace and an investigation, had simply disappeared, leaving his tin star on his desk. The town council, in their first act of true wisdom, had elected the blacksmith, a man who built things, as the new town marshal. That spring, Benno led the dun colt out into the yard. On its back was a new saddle. It was a small, youth-sized saddle, and he had made every inch of it himself. The stitching, while strong, was hopelessly crooked. The cantle was set at a slight angle. His attempt at tooling a sunflower on the fender looked more like a startled octopus. He was beaming, his face alight with a pride so pure it was painful to see. "It's done, Aunt Lydia," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. It's not very straight." Lydia walked around it, her face serious. She ran her hand over the crooked fender, felt the solid seat. She looked at him. "Benno," she said, her voice soft. "An honest piece of work is always straight. And this is the most honest saddle in Wyoming. You are a true craftsman." Rafe watched from the porch, his heart so full he could not speak. The seasons turned. The first snows of winter fell, blanketing the blue mesa in a deep, clean silence. In the ranch house, the fire in the stove burned bright. Benno, exhausted from his chores, was asleep on a pallet by the hearth. Rafe sat at the table, his right arm now fully healed, carefully repairing a broken hinge on a lantern. Lydia sat opposite him, reading a book, her hand resting on the table near his. Auntie Ione rocked in her chair, her eyes on the flames. "It is a good house," she said, her voice a dry, papery rustle. "The spirits of the land are settled. They are whole." She looked at Rafe and Lydia, at the quiet, powerful comfort that existed between them. They did not need to talk. They simply fit. "In the old days, my grandfather called this hozo," she murmured, "a rightness, a balance with the world. When everything is as it should be," she smiled, a deep, knowing smile. "You white people, you have a word for it. Some call it love. I just call it wholeness." They had been married on a Saturday. That night, after the celebration, after the neighbors had ridden home, after Auntie Ione had taken Benno to his room, the house was finally completely quiet. A single lamp burned in their room, the one that had been Rafe's. He closed the door, and the soft click of the latch seemed to shut out the entire world. Lydia stood by the bed, her hands trembling. For all the battles she had fought, for all the strength she possessed, this was a new, uncharted territory, and she was, for the first time, afraid. She went to undo the simple buttons on her muslin dress, but her fingers fumbled. She felt him come up behind her. He did not touch her. He just stood there, his warmth at her back. "Lydia," he whispered, his voice thick. Then, his hands, calloused and warm, came to rest on her shoulders. He did not turn her around. He simply leaned his forehead against her back, between her strong shoulder blades. It was a gesture of complete surrender, of total peace. She covered his hands with her own, and they stood, just breathing, for a long, silent moment. He turned her slowly. He looked at her face, at the wide, nervous eyes, at the strong jaw. His gray eyes were dark and filled with a quiet, reverent wonder. He traced the line of her cheekbone with his thumb. He leaned in, and his kiss was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the kitchen. It was a long, slow, deep kiss of arrival. It was a kiss that said, "You are home." It was a kiss that said, "Mine." A small laugh, a sound of pure, surprised joy, bubbled in her throat as he pulled back, only to kiss her again, more deeply this time. He lifted her, his arms, both strong, both healed, taking her weight as if she were nothing. She, who had always been told she was too much, felt, for the first time in her life, perfectly, wonderfully light. He carried her to the bed. The lamp wick was turned down. The shadows in the room softened, merged, and the world faded to a gentle, healing warmth. The next morning, they rose before the sun. They dressed in silence, moving around each other in the easy, practiced rhythm of a couple who had known each other for a lifetime. They did not speak. They did not need to. They saddled the bay and the dun colt. They rode out, not for work, not for patrol, but just to ride. They stopped at the crest of the Blue Mesa, the same spot where they had watched the hail clouds gather. They looked down on their valley as the sun began to break the horizon. The storm had passed. A new, gentle rain had fallen in the night. The land was not a wreck of mud and ice. It was clean, vibrant, and alive. The tamarack ditch, their ditch, was full. The new, shared headgate holding fast. The water snaked across the valley floor, catching the first rays of the dawn, glittering like a ribbon of pure, liquid silver. Rafe moved his horse closer and put his hand over hers where it rested on the saddle horn. She looked at his hand, then at his face. He was smiling, a real, easy smile. She smiled back. In Juniper Crossing, they used to measure a person by their weight. They were measured by what they lacked or by what they had too much of. Today, they measured a person by what they could lift. They sat for a long time, watching their future glitter below them. A rider was coming up the trail from the south, coming fast. It was the new marshal, the blacksmith, his face grim. He pulled his horse up, the animal's flanks heaving. "Rafe, Lydia," he panted, not wasting time on pleasantries. Word just came over the telegraph wire. A whole wagon train of settlers, new families, mostly German. They tried to beat the snow by taking the high pass. He pointed to the high, distant peaks to the west, already white with an early snow. "They're trapped, stuck fast on Eagle's Ladder. Axles broken, livestock dying. The weather's turning bad. And they've got children with them." Rafe stared at the distant, unforgiving peaks. He looked at his peaceful valley, his safe ranch. He looked at his wife. Lydia did not hesitate. She was already checking the rigging on her saddle, her mind all function. "They'll need a guide who knows that pass," Rafe said, thinking aloud. "And," Lydia added, pulling her cinch tight, "they will need someone who can mend broken wagon tongues and stitch frozen canvas." Rafe looked at her, his heart so full it ached. He nodded to the marshal. "Tell the town we're gathering supplies. We ride in 1 hour." The marshal nodded and wheeled his horse, galloping back to Juniper Crossing. Rafe turned his horse toward the high peaks. Lydia turned hers, falling into place beside him. "We should go," he said. "We should," she agreed, and they rode, side by side, toward the new trouble. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts and connect with us. And if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And give us your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more.